Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are taking a really fascinating look at a massive piece of modern American history. Over the next few minutes, we're going to explore the 20-year evolution of the Department of Homeland Security, or as you probably know it, DHS. We're going to trace its timeline right from its rapid creation under George W. Bush all the way through to the Biden era. We'll be looking at how its policies, its funding, and its surveillance methods have shifted over time, and honestly, in many ways, how they've stayed exactly the same. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The birth of DHS. 2. Bush's era of surveillance. 3. Obama's focus on extremism. 4. Trump's immigration crackdown. And finally 5. Biden and the future.
Section 1. The birth of DHS.
To really understand this department, we have to rewind back to the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks. The American government, responding to this massive climate of national fear, pushed for a major structural change. Basically, they wanted a single permanent security department. Honestly, it was a restructuring of the federal government on a scale we literally hadn't seen since FDR's New Deal in the 1940s. In October 2001, the temporary Office of Homeland Security was created. Barely a year later, in November 2002, the creation of the permanent department was officially signed into law. And by March 2003, operations were underway, with most component agencies already transferred over. The sheer speed of this mobilization was absolutely unprecedented.
So what exactly was transferred over? 22. That is the number of different component agencies that were completely funneled into the newly formed DHS. We're talking about everything from disaster response and the Coast Guard, all the way to nuclear material monitoring and the Secret Service. It was this enormous consolidation of power, and as you might guess, funding for these agencies absolutely skyrocketed, more than doubling in just the 2 years right after the department was formed.
Section 2. Bush's era of surveillance. The George W. Bush era of DHS was largely defined by a massive increase in law enforcement power. But more importantly, it was the expansion of that power all the way down to the level of local police. To give you a sense of what that actually looked like on the ground, Nicole Wong, an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, points out that the approach was to imbue police with sweeping powers. She notes that New York City police officers were just going right into Muslim communities, literally mapping out bars and sports venues. It essentially became a blanket, highly invasive surveillance operation, all conducted directly under the guise of national security.
Now, one of the earliest formal implementations of this strategy was called NSEERS, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. Launched back in 2002, this program required non-citizen men of specific ages to physically register with immigration offices as soon as they entered the country. And here's the crucial detail. 24 of the 25 countries on that special registration list were Muslim-majority nations. This really clearly demonstrates the department's early reliance on racial and religious profiling policies.
Get this, just a year into the NSEERS program, 138,000 people had been registered. That's a huge number of people. Yet over a decade later, the result was exactly 0 known terrorism convictions stemming from the program. None. It is a really stark contrast between having these massive surveillance numbers on one hand and yielding 0 actual measurable security outcomes on the other. And the financial cost? It was just as staggering. As President Bush's tenure was coming to a close, a House Committee on Homeland Security actually reported that DHS had overseen almost $15 billion, yes, billion with a B, in failed and completely inefficient contracts. The committee cited a lack of game plans, poorly defined requirements, and just overall inadequate oversight as the main drivers of these massive, massive costs.
Real quick before we move on to our next presidential era, if you're enjoying this explainer and finding the breakdown helpful, please take just a quick second to like the video, share it, and hit that subscribe button. Your support is what helps us keep making these deep dives.
Section 3. Obama's focus on extremism.
So, with a new administration came the promise of a new era of progressive oversight. But, funding and domestic surveillance actually increased under President Obama. The operating theory was that law enforcement could just partner with local communities to prevent violence. And this brilliantly illustrates a lingering structural issue. In 2009, an operative boarded a flight with an explosive, but he failed to detonate it. Now, that attack wasn't thwarted by DHS intelligence. It actually only failed due to the bomber's own incompetence. It was a foundational failure by DHS to communicate across its own agencies that allowed this guy on the plane in the first place. Yet, in response to that failure, President Obama actually increased the very surveillance and security efforts that had just let him slip through. A huge part of this increased effort was the CVE program, which launched in 2011. CVE stands for Countering Violent Extremism, and it was essentially a grant program providing funding to state and local communities. The core idea here was to ask everyday, ordinary people, think teachers, therapists, community leaders, to identify potential terrorist threats in their daily lives and report them straight to law enforcement.
However, experts note that this approach heavily targeted very specific communities. Legal expert Harsha Panduranga explains that when you tailor a program that way, what you are essentially doing is telling people they are more susceptible to terrorism simply because of where they come from. The program relied super heavily on vague religious indicators, things like growing a beard or attending a mosque more frequently. Critics argue that this didn't make us safer, but simply justified preconceived biases against Muslims.
This heavy reliance on a highly subjective indicators was also formalized in our airports. In 2011, DHS launched the SPOT program within the TSA. SPOT operated on this theory that observable behavioral and appearance indicators could somehow be used to detect terrorists, and they implemented this despite the fact that there was absolutely no social science backing up the idea that behavioral detection efforts actually prevent terrorism.
To put that into perspective, a government study revealed that the SPOT program cost over $200 million every single year. They deployed about 3,000 behavioral detection officers to 161 airports nationwide. And yet, exactly like the earlier programs we talked about, none of these contracts led to any measurable terror prevention outcomes.
Which leads us to a pretty critical question, right? If, after a decade of massive spending and widespread surveillance, DHS still struggles to stop terrorist attacks through its core systems, what exactly is its purpose? Well, the government's answer, surprisingly enough, was to just up the department's funding once again as we transitioned into the next administration.
Section 4. Trump's Immigration Crackdown.
Moving into the Trump era, we saw overt anti-immigrant sentiment become explicit federal policy. In just the very first year of his presidency, a string of executive orders targeting undocumented immigrants resulted in a massive 40% surge in immigration arrests, alongside very public policies like the travel ban targeting Muslim-majority countries. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the Trump administration also heavily utilized the tools left behind by Obama. Rather than scrapping those CVE grant programs, he inflated them. A study actually found that at least 85% of these CVE grants explicitly targeted minority groups during this era.
And meanwhile, the budget just continued to swell. DHS funding expanded from $40 billion at the start of Trump's term to a whopping $52 billion by the end. This massive budget also covered the millions of dollars DHS spent deploying federal agents across the country in response to racial justice protests during 2020. As we get ready to transition to our final administration, here is a quick reminder for all of our focused learners out there. If you appreciate these structured, impartial explainers, please give us a like, share this with a friend, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss out on a new topic. Section 5. Biden and the Future.
Following the deadly January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, the incoming Biden administration shifted DHS policy to focus heavily on white supremacist and far-right domestic terrorism, which, by the way, DHS itself had identified as the deadliest domestic terror threat. However, Professor Nguyen points out that there is a really striking continuity across all of these presidential administrations. Tinkering with programs or just shifting the focus doesn't actually change the foundational machinery of the department. Just like his predecessors, Biden increased DHS's funding once again. Critics argue that regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office, this continuous expansion inevitably maintains a system that historically targets Muslim, Black, and Brown communities.
So we are going to end on this final provocative thought. Will the ongoing issues that led to the creation of DHS in the first place, namely that lack of transparent and timely interagency communication, ever actually be resolved? Or are we just locked into a 20-year cycle of unchanged fundamental flaws and constantly expanding budgets? It's definitely a critical question to consider as we watch the future of this massive department unfold. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.